Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Hayuvel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. So a lot going on right now. We're gearing up for the summer trip. Got volunteers coming in the next couple weeks. Also our Sons of Zion are gearing up to come over. And our Daughters of Zion program. The harvest looks like we've got applications are rolling in, and it's going to be another really amazing harvest time. So we're just in prep mode for that next season coming up. So lots going on around here. Lots of good things happening. Also had a little bit of on a personal note, we had a little injury this last week. My son Shlomo was sliding down a slide at the playground and fell off and broke his arm. So we had to rush to the hospital and get it set and fixed up. It was like one of those breaks where you look at it and your gut just kind of twists a little bit. And you're like, oh, you can just, things weren't straight. But thank God, got it all set back. It's got a cast on and should be 6 weeks in the cast, and then he should be good to go. So I'm thankful for the Israeli doctor who was able to get him all fixed up in pretty short order. So we're thankful for that, and thankful that he seems to be doing great. He's being a real trooper and handling it very well. So appreciate your prayers for him to have a speedy recovery. So this week's Torah portion, we are in Shelach, which means sent. We're in Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 15, verse 41. And this portion is the famous portion about the 12 spies and God commanding Moses to send these spies up into the land of Canaan. And then Moshe gathering together these 12 leaders of the tribes and then sending them out to spy out the land. At Hayuvel here, we've really connected to this story in a really big way because we see that most of the God-fearing world, all the people in the world that are even God-fearing people, they tend to look out, even nowadays, they tend to look at Israel through the eyes, through the glasses, through the lens that the 12 spies saw Israel. And what I mean by that is most of, even the God-fearing world, sees Israel as, with the terrorism, and that, and they'll say that, Israel should give away land or not possess certain areas of the land. And really, it's a direct contradiction to what God's word says, that, and it's a lack of faith to believe that God will fulfill his word, what it says in the Bible. And so unfortunately, this 10 spies phenomenon, this belief, or this lack of belief that we see in the 12 spies is actually very alive and well today. We see that this message of the 10 spies of there's giants in the land, the bad things, right? The fear and the lack of faith is happening even today in our time, especially amongst Christians, unfortunately. And we'll get into a little bit more about why in a little bit. But we see that what we're doing here at Hayuvel, as educating those God-fearing people all over the world to see the truth of what is really happening, the reality of what's happening here in the land of Israel, that actually is a very, very good land, right? That's what we see happening in here. It's like the 10 spies are going back and forth, and they're saying, oh, but there's beautiful produce, but there's giants, and there's walled cities up to the heavens, and we were like grasshoppers. And Joshua and Caleb were like, no, the land is good. It's the land of milk and honey, and God is more than able to bring us into this very, very good land. In Hebrew, actually, they use the word very, me'od, like twice. Me'od. It's like very, very good land. So we have this crazy drama going on with the children of Israel. And so we feel like, kind of in the same way, we are taking what we've seen and heard here in the land of Israel, the good things that are happening, and we're saying no to that message of the 10 spies. And we're saying there's good things. The land is very, very good. And one of the main ways that our perspective has been changed through being here in the land is through meeting the people in the land, hearing their stories, and seeing the reality of what's happening right here, right now in the heartland of Israel, specifically in Judea and Samaria. And that's why we put so much effort into producing the Joshua and Caleb Report films, so that people can hear those real live stories from people who live here, and they can get that false narrative, whatever lies they're hearing, that 10 Spies version of the story corrected, and hear these true accounts of the men and women of faith that are living here in Judea and Samaria today. So I want to dig a little bit more into this whole concept. I really enjoy, reading the Bible and thinking about what living then must have been like. But I always try to think, okay, so what does this mean for me today? Like, what kind of practical application, can I apply to my life? Because obviously, God preserved this word not so I could hear this nice story or terrible story that happened back in biblical times, but so that I can learn. I mean, God preserved his word through the Jewish people for thousands of years so that we could have these accounts today. And so I think it's really, really important for us to look at it that way, to say, what does this mean for me? How can I learn from this? Not just getting into the story of what happened then, but how does it apply to me now? So I have a few thoughts and a few questions. The first thing that I thought of here is that this was a pretty major punishment given to the people of Israel for this sin. This was not just a light thing, not something that just over in a few days, not something that was taken lightly at all. This was like the most serious punishment of all the Bible, as far as I can think. I mean, this was a really big deal. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, okay, what was the sin, right? If we're going to learn from this, we need to say, okay, what was the sin that happened here? And so I'm sure there's a lot of different ideas, and I definitely tend to take the Jewish route on looking at some of this stuff and thinking, okay, there's definitely more than one answer. But as I was thinking through this, what really spoke to me as I was working through this is, at first it looks like, okay, so their sin was that they didn't obey, right? God told them to go into the land, and they didn't do it. They said no. So at first it's like, okay, they're just being rebellious, they're being obstinate, they're just not following God's will. But then it's like, well, not exactly. It's not like they're just being obstinate, because they really actually had some pretty legitimate questions and fears going on here, right? So maybe that's the answer. Maybe their sin was that they were afraid, right? They're saying there's giants and there's fortified cities, and they were scared, right? But then again, if we think about that, do you think God expected them not to be afraid of these very scary things? And I think, again, practical application to our lives, God somehow, for some reason, put us in this world, and there are certain things that are scary. So I don't think that God necessarily wants us to not have fears, but he wants us to overcome those fears with faith. So that's the answer that I'm getting out of this, and what I'm coming to now is that their sin was that they didn't have faith, right? Joshua and Caleb saw the giants. They knew that they were, in natural terms, that there was no way they were going to be able to defeat these huge guys. And, according to the Jewish thought on this, is that even these big clusters and the abundant produce they brought back was actually added to the fear of the people, because they're like, wow, what kind of people would eat this kind of fruit that's huge? The people must be, huge. And so, like, every piece, even the very positive things, were turned to seem bad. And so what I'm getting from this, and the answer that I've come to, is that their sin was they didn't believe in God. They didn't have faith to believe that God would do what he said he would do, right? Which was bring them into the land. And God had promised, this and made this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Like, this was a really big deal. And for generations, they'd passed this thing down that he would do this thing. And then they got there, and then they didn't believe God's promise. So where are we at today? Do we have faith to believe that God will do what he said he would do? And obviously I'm pointing to the fact that God said that he would restore Israel, right? That the Jewish people will return from the four corners of the earth. And there's more than 50 prophecies in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, that talk about this return of the Jewish people. God said this was going to happen. The Jewish people would return from the four corners of the earth, that the land would shoot forth its branches, right? I love to tell people it's such a crazy thing that 25, 30 years ago, there were no vineyards on the mountains of Samaria. Just last year, our volunteers harvested 450 tons of grapes. Like, there's something happening here. The land is shooting forth its branches, just like the prophet said that they would. And then that the nations would come and participate in this rebuilding and in prayer, right? That God's temple, the temple would be a house of prayer for all nations. So, obviously I believe that this is happening right now, that we're seeing these things come to pass. I mean, to me, being here for the last 14 years and seeing it, when we first came here, it was kind of like, well, we don't want to be, maybe arrogant or something to say that, yes, this is definitely happening. For me to say that a prophecy is definitely happening right now, maybe that's, going too far for me to say that. But over the last 14 years, I mean, it is so clear. I mean, these things are impossible. Like, there is no way that a nation could return, a people group could all return back to their homeland, that a dead language would be restored, that the soil would just change. We were farmers in Tennessee. Soil just doesn't change. You can cultivate it and add fertilizers and do different things to bring healing back to the soil or whatever, but it doesn't just all of a sudden change. Here in Israel, all of a sudden it's like boom. It's like all of a sudden the soil, like, things are just happening. And there's research being done about how certain insects and life and the rain cycles and like all these things are just. It's like I like to say, God flipped the restoration switch and all of a sudden it's here. So I am a firm believer that this is happening right now. But unfortunately, many God-fearing people. I'm not talking about all the secular, atheist, agnostic people who obviously don't have a connection to the Bible, or don't believe in their connection to the Bible and the truth in it. I'm talking about God-fearing people. They don't have faith to see it. They don't truly believe what God is doing right now in the land of Israel. And just like the giants and the fortified cities stole the 10 spies' faith, Christians are making excuses for why they don't have the faith to believe that God is doing and will continue to do what he said he would. And so I want to kind of break this down a little bit, because as we've traveled around, spoken different places, and interacted with different people, we have run across several of these things. And so obviously the most blatant one is replacement theology, right? I have replaced Israel, the Jewish people, the Israelites. God used them to bring the Messiah into the world, but then once Messiah came, they rejected him. And then from then on, everybody who believed in the Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua, was part of God's people. And if you didn't, then you weren't. That unfortunately takes the faith right out of a belief that God would still actually use a physical land and a physical people here in the land of Israel. It's easy to spiritualize the whole thing. Oh, we're the spiritual Israel and these kind of things. So obviously, I think most of you guys listening to this are very opposed to that type of theology, and we realize that God made a covenant, right? And that's the biggest thing for me in refuting replacement theology. Obviously, you could do a 10 podcast on all the different details, but the main thing to me is God made a covenant. Said this land would go to Abraham and his descendants forever, and God doesn't break his promises. God doesn't revoke his covenant. And there's several times throughout the scriptures that talk about how God's covenant with the people of Israel will not be broken as long as the sun and the moon and the stars are all in their rotation, or whatever. And over and over again talks about, like I was saying, that the Jewish people would return, right? So it's impossible. It does not make biblical sense to say that there has been a replacement. But unfortunately, this idea has really stolen people's faith in believing that God could actually work in a physical land of Israel, physical people, the Jewish people, the people of Israel. So that's obviously a pretty big one. The other one that I've heard quite a bit is that, well, the nation of Israel right now, it's a secular state. So, in other words, eventually there's going to be a restoration. We believe that we haven't replaced Israel, that God's still going to do something in the land of Israel with the Jewish people, but what's happening right now isn't the real deal because it's a secular state, because there are secular values that are taking place in the land of Israel, and there are a lack of morality. Tel Aviv, there's all kinds of awful, horrible things happening there. So obviously this isn't God. This is just a man-made effort on the Jewish people's part to, just help themselves. It's all a selfish initiative for the Jewish people, basically, is where it goes. And so, first off, that obviously is a very anti-Semitic way of thinking, that the Jewish people are just out for themselves, and I think that's probably been a huge thing for us too, and why the Joshua and Caleb reports are so powerful, because it really shows how the Jewish people love God, and the reason why they're living here in Judea and Samaria is because they love God, because they believe in the Bible, because they have faith, right? They are the Joshua and Calebs of this generation that are stepping forward and saying, we believe in the Bible, we believe in God, we love God, we want to be a part of what he's doing, we want to join with him in this redemption that's happening, and we want to do whatever we can to be a part of that. I just been reading this amazing book. It's a autobiography about Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was a chief rabbi at the IDF in 1967. So you've probably seen a picture of him with the shofar at the Western Wall when the old city was recaptured. And the paratroopers went in and retook the old city. But this book is like blowing out of the water any thought that Israel was just a secular state. I mean, there's conversations recorded in this book about him as the IDF chief rabbi, conversations with him and David Ben Gurion, where a lot of the secular people are within the government are saying, hey, we really don't need to worry about any kind of biblical thing about having kosher kitchens for the IDF, or about doing these different building synagogues for the soldiers to pray in, or these different religious things or whatever. And David Ben Gurion asked Rabbi Shlomo Goren, said, so what do you think? And Rabbi Shlomo Goren said, what are you talking about? Now, after 2,000 years of being in exile, finally we have a nation of Jewish people. Finally we have a Jewish army since the time of King David. We're not going to follow our Jewish customs and these things that God has given us. There's no way we're going to be successful if we don't bring in these biblical moral values. And so these conversations were happening in the birth of the state of Israel between David Ben Gurion. And David Ben Gurion said, yes, that's right. And David Ben Gurion is going to these Passover Seders, and a lot of Jewish people would even say that they're secular, but then they go and celebrate, the feast, go to synagogue on Yom Kippur and pray. Like, the idea of secular in Israel is a little bit different than so basically it means they're not as observant. A huge percentage of the people in Israel do very biblical things and have biblical moral values. And it's, from what I understand, it's the only country in the world that's actually becoming more, I think there were these conservative, but basically studying the Bible. I was reading something a while back about how Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is working to bring Bible study into the schools. Like, what other country in the world is doing that? To say that it's just a secular state is, for one, basically showing ignorance on how much you actually know about how Israel was founded. And that's what I've seen a lot of people that I've talked to that start saying this. I said, well, have you actually studied? Have you actually been to Israel? Have you actually, been a part of what's happening there? And usually it's, well, no, I just read this on the internet. And I'm like, guys, don't let these lies steal your faith and strip you of being able to join and partner with God in this redemptive thing that's happening in the land of Israel. This is a big deal that God is doing, and God wants you to be a part of it. And if you love God, then love what he loves, And so we have these, obviously I'm very passionate about this, but these conversations that we've actually had with a lot of people as we've traveled around and spoken to people. The other big one that we've heard is, what's happening in Israel right now, and a redemptive thing happening in Israel doesn't really match up with my timeline of what's going to happen in the end times. And so obviously it's all just a coincidence that all these things are happening, and the miracles of the 6-day war and all this stuff that happened, it just kind of happened just because, I don't know, it's just a coincidence. But it obviously doesn't line up with what's supposed to happen, what I think is supposed to happen in the end times. So all this is just a bunch of fluff and a bunch of people getting excited about nothing. So obviously, if your timeline doesn't work with the reality of what's happening here in Israel, I would strongly suggest you take another look at your timeline and look at the reality of what's happening. Again, educate yourself about what is going on in the land of Israel, the Jewish people returning from all over the world, the land of Israel being restored, nations coming in to be a part of what's happening. I mean, the rain cycles being restored. These are miracles that could only happen by Almighty God's hand. And so we need to come in humility and realize that, okay, it's great to study timelines, but recognize the reality of what's happening. I feel like, God is right there. It's like in the Torah portion, the children of Israel are ready to go into the land. It's like the redemption is right here. And some people are saying, well, I'm not so sure. And their faith is being sucked right out of them. And I'm very passionate about this, like I said, and I want people to understand the reality of what's happening. The other one I've heard is that, well, and this is obviously very anti-Semitic, and I kind of touched on this before, but that the Jewish people are, it's kind of the replacement theology kind of thing too, but just that the Jews are evil people who are just out for themselves. They're just trying to take everybody's money, everybody's land, everybody's, whatever, and the secular media really plays into this one, demonizing the state of Israel. And so people play into that, the Jewish people, they're just this and they're just that, and it's really a serious anti-Semitic thing. So these are some of the obstacles that I'm seeing, some of the modern-day giants, some of the modern-day fortifications that are keeping God-fearing people from having faith to believe that God is actually doing what he said that he's going to do. And I believe that it's time for all God-fearing people, everyone that calls upon the name of the Lord, to put on the faith of our fathers and believe that this is God, that this is a supernatural thing that could only happen through God's strength, and that God can take care of the giants, that his word is that he will restore the people of Israel to the land of Israel, and that the nations will come and participate in that redemption process. So maybe you're saying, okay, so I get that we need to have faith in that God will fulfill his word. That makes a lot of sense, but why is his word about Israel such a big priority? What about the great things he's doing in other countries in the United States? What about my family, the promises that God has for me? What about to all the people of the world? Why do we have to focus on the Jewish people, on the land of Israel? So there's a few scriptures I want to read through quickly. We're running out of time, so I'm going to try to make it quick. Psalm chapter 50, verse 2 says, "Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth." And there are so many scriptures that talk about how God is using Israel as the platform, as the theater for salvation to the world, that God shines forth from Israel. So it's not that Israel is more special. It's not that the Jewish people are more special. They are chosen to be lights, to shine forth to the rest of the nations. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, and this is also repeated in the book of Micah. It says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it." So there's a literal physical reality of people coming to it. "Many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law." So again, it's this emanating out of Zion. So we need to be focused in on Zion so that we see this light. Isaiah 60 talks about the nations coming to your light. And in Romans, it talks about the significance of the nations seeing what's happening in Israel. So Israel is the light to the world, the physical place, Zion. Israel's been chosen to represent God in this world and to eventually be the catalyst from which salvation will spread and reach every corner of the world. So we have to be focused in on Israel. Thanks so much for listening, and Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.
Restoration.